The moment Lucy Brooks rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on the back of a borrowed mule with nothing but a carpetbag and a heart full of determination, she knew that the life she had left behind in Cincinnati was gone forever, and what lay ahead of her in this sun-scorched, wind-battered town was either going to save her or break her completely. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning too far over a cliff, wild and restless and smelling of cattle dust and wood smoke. The main street was wide enough to turn a full wagon team around in, and the boardwalks on either side were packed with trail hands, merchants, and the occasional gambler who had found the town useful for a night or two. Lucy pulled her mule to a stop in front of the general store and slid down from the saddle with all the grace of someone who had been riding for 3 days straight. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a gray bonnet that had seen better years, and her blue dress, though dusty at the hem, still carried itself with a quiet dignity that made more than one passerby glance twice. She had come to Caldwell because she had answered an advertisement placed in the Cincinnati Gazette by a rancher who needed a schoolteacher for the children of his ranch hands and the surrounding homesteaders. The letter she had received in return had been brief and businesslike, signed by a man named Samuel Whitmore, who owned a spread called the Double W Ranch some 7 miles south of town. He had offered room, board, and a modest wage. Lucy had accepted before the ink on his letter had fully dried. She had reasons to leave Cincinnati that she did not speak of easily. Her father had died owing money to men who were not patient about such things. Her mother had remarried quickly and badly, and the small house Lucy had grown up in was no longer a place she recognized. She was 24 years old, trained as a school teacher, and she had decided that if her life was going to be difficult regardless of where she stood, she might as well stand somewhere that at least offered open sky. The general store was run by a compact, cheerful woman named Hattie Drummond, who had a voice like a church bell and the memory of an elephant. When Lucy stepped inside and introduced herself, Hattie immediately produced a cup of coffee and a chair, as though she had been expecting a weary traveler and was simply glad the right one had finally arrived. "So you are the schoolteacher Whitmore sent for," Hattie said, settling herself on the other side of the counter with a satisfied nod. "He mentioned it last week when he came in for flour and seed. Good man, Samuel is, though he works his hands half to death. You will find it busy out at the Double W this time of year." "I do not mind busy," Lucy said, and she meant it. "What you might mind," Hattie continued, lowering her voice by precisely 1 degree, as though the cans of beans on the shelf might be listening, "is Frederick Donovan." The name landed in the air between them with the weight of something that had been said many times before. "And who is Frederick Donovan?" Lucy asked. Hattie studied her for a moment as though deciding how much information was appropriate for a first meeting. "He is Whitmore's foreman," she finally said. "Has been for 4 years now. Good at his job, no one disputes that. He knows cattle, he knows the land, and he knows how to manage men, which is no small thing out here. But he is," she paused again, searching for the right word, "difficult." "Difficult how?" "He does not warm to strangers quickly. And he has made it known on more than one occasion that he does not believe a schoolteacher is necessary for ranch hands and their children. Says it is a distraction. Says the children ought to be learning the land, not letters." Hattie folded her hands on the counter. He was not shy about saying so to Whitmore's face either, which tells you something about the man. Lucy absorbed this information with the careful attention of someone who had grown up navigating complicated households. "Well," she said, setting down her coffee cup, "I have managed difficult before." She had no idea in that moment how true that statement was about to become. The road to the Double W Ranch was a long, dry, red dirt track that wound through rolling grassland thick with spring buffalo grass and scattered wildflowers. A ranch hand named Pete, who was barely more than a boy with a wide hat and an even wider grin, had been sent to collect her from town in a wagon, and he talked the entire 7 miles without appearing to need any response from her whatsoever, which she found both amusing and restful after the long journey. The Double W itself was a substantial operation. The main house was a 2-story white clapboard structure with a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. Behind it sprawled a collection of barns, corrals, a bunkhouse, and a series of smaller outbuildings that spoke to the complexity of running a cattle operation of this size. As the wagon pulled into the yard, Lucy could see cattle in the distant pastures and hear the sounds of men working somewhere beyond the large red barn. Samuel Whitmore met her on the porch. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray beard and the deeply tanned, furrowed face of someone who had spent 30 years looking into the Kansas sun. He shook her hand with genuine warmth and introduced her to his wife, Clara, a slight, bird-like woman with quick eyes and a gracious manner, who immediately took Lucy inside and showed her to the room that had been prepared for her on the 2nd floor. It was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the east pasture, and Lucy felt something settle in her chest when she saw it. It was hers. It was a start. Dinner that evening was taken in the main house with the Whitmores and the 2 other permanent household staff, a cook named Bess, and a grizzled older hand called Doc who managed the smokehouse and the vegetable garden with equal devotion. Frederick Donovan was not there, and no one mentioned his absence until Samuel, passing the bread, said casually, "Frederick is out with the night crew checking the south fence line. He will be back in the morning. I have told him about your arrival, Miss Brooks." Clara Whitmore caught Lucy's eye across the table and offered the smallest, most sympathetic smile. Lucy slept well that night, which surprised her. She had half expected to lie awake second-guessing herself, measuring the distance between Kansas and everything she had known. But the bed was comfortable and the prairie wind was quiet and low, and she woke with the dawn birds feeling something she had not felt in months. Ready. She was in the kitchen with Bess, eating breakfast and discussing the proposed schoolroom which was to be set up in the old tack room of the smaller barn, when she heard boots on the porch boards. Not soft footsteps, deliberate ones. The kind that announced a person before they arrived, as though their very way of walking stated an opinion about the world. Frederick Donovan came through the kitchen door with trail dust still on his coat, and the expression of a man who had been awake since before the stars had faded. He was taller than she had imagined, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead by what had clearly been a hat now hanging from one hand. He had strong features, a jaw that looked like it had made a few hard decisions, and dark eyes that moved around a room the way a man's eyes do when he has been responsible for other people's safety for a long time. They landed on Lucy with the directness of someone who did not see the point in pretending he was not looking. "Miss Brooks," he said, and his voice was low and even, not unfriendly exactly, but not warm either. It was the voice of a man who said what was necessary and nothing more. "Mr. Donovan," she said, and held his gaze steadily. She had learned early in life that the first moment of eye contact with a difficult person set the tone for everything that followed. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. "Welcome to the Double W," he said, and then he went to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee, and was out the door in less time than it had taken Lucy to pour cream in her own cup. Bess watched the door close and then looked at Lucy with something between admiration and concern. "He spoke more words just now than he usually does before noon," she said. "The first week was a study in parallel existence." Lucy threw herself into preparing the schoolroom with the kind of focused energy she used when she needed to not think too hard about the bigger picture. She scrubbed the tack room walls and floor, brought in a table and 6 mismatched chairs, fashioned a chalkboard from a piece of smooth wood painted black, and borrowed primers and arithmetic books from the town library through Hattie Drummond, who seemed to operate as a kind of informal postal and supply service for everyone within 20 miles. The children came on Monday morning. There were 8 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 12, belonging to 4 different families associated with the Double W, including 2 of the Whitmore grandchildren who were visiting from Topeka. They were collectively curious, collectively fidgety, and collectively more interested in Lucy City's shoes than in the alphabet she was attempting to introduce. But by the end of the first week, she had established a routine, learned all their names and their individual ways of thinking, and begun to feel the particular satisfaction of work that mattered. Frederick Donovan, meanwhile, managed to be both constantly present on the ranch and almost entirely absent from any space Lucy occupied. She saw him at a distance in the mornings, directing the day's work from horseback with the natural authority of a man born to the position. She heard his voice in the evenings through the walls of the main house when he gave Samuel his daily report. Once, she passed him in the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the dining room, and they exchanged a brief nod, and she noticed that he smelled of horse and leather and something dry and clean like sage. It was the end of the second week when their first real conversation happened, and it happened because of a horse. One of the older ranch horses, a gray mare called Duchess, had gotten out of the south pasture through a gap in the fence and wandered to the edge of the property where the schoolroom barn stood. Lucy had dismissed the children for the afternoon and was walking back toward the main house when she found Duchess standing in the middle of the path, looking philosophical about her own escape. Lucy stopped. The horse regarded her with one large, amber eye. Lucy had grown up in Cincinnati, which was not exactly short on horses, and she had learned to ride as a girl, though she was no cowhand. She assessed the situation. The mare was not frightened, just free, and did not appear interested in going anywhere urgently. There was no one else in sight. She approached slowly and calmly, speaking in a low voice the way her father had taught her, and when she was close enough she took gentle hold of the horse's halter, which mercifully was still attached. She was leading Duchess back toward the south pasture when Frederick Donovan appeared around the corner of the barn on his own horse, clearly already looking for the mare. He pulled up short when he saw Lucy leading the escaped horse with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had done it 100 times. He said nothing for a moment, then he swung down from his horse in one easy movement and came toward her. "I will take her," he said. "She is fine," Lucy said. "I have her." Another pause. He looked at her, then at Duchess, then back at her. "You are not afraid of horses," he said, and it came out sounding less like a compliment and more like a fact he was filing away. "Should I be?" He almost smiled. She saw it happen at the corner of his mouth and then unhappen like a thought he changed his mind about sharing. "No," he said. "I suppose not." He walked beside her while she led the mare the rest of the way to the south pasture gate, which he opened, and she led Duchess through. When the gate was latched again and the mare was wandering contentedly back toward the other horses, Frederick stood with his arms resting on the top rail and looked out at the herd with the quiet attention of a man whose relationship with the land and its animals was the most honest one in his life. "She gets out every spring," he said. "Same gap in the fence. We patch it and she finds another way through." "She is determined," Lucy said. "She is stubborn," he replied. But there was a note of genuine affection in his voice when he said it. Lucy leaned on the fence beside him, leaving a comfortable distance between them. The afternoon light was long and golden across the pasture, and somewhere in the far distance, a meadowlark was constructing its bright, intricate song. She decided that this was possibly the right moment to address what had been sitting between them unspoken since her arrival. "Hattie Drummond tells me you do not believe the children need a school teacher," she said, keeping her voice conversational. He was quiet for a moment. She could see the slight tension in his jaw that meant he was deciding how honest to be. "I believe the children need to know the land," he said at last. "Reading and arithmetic are useful, but out here, what keeps people alive is knowing weather and water and cattle. I learned those things before I learned to read, and I do not consider myself worse off for it. "And did you eventually learn to read?" she asked. He turned to look at her directly, and there was a flash of something sharp in his eyes that was not quite offense and not quite amusement. "I did," he said. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "someone somewhere thought it worth the time to teach you, even if you were also learning the land." The sharp thing in his eyes changed into something else. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he looked back at the pasture. "Perhaps," he said. It was not agreement, but it was not dismissal either, and Lucy recognized it for the progress it was. After that afternoon at the fence, something shifted between them. It did not happen dramatically or all at once. It happened the way a season changes, through small accumulations that you only notice when you look back and realize that the air feels entirely different from what it did before. He started appearing at the edge of the schoolroom barn in the mornings, ostensibly checking on one thing or another, but clearly listening to her teach. She pretended not to notice. The children noticed, and one of the younger ones, a girl named Elsa, whispered to her friend during reading time that Mr. Donovan was watching again, which made the friend giggle and made Lucy press her lips together to keep from smiling. One afternoon he came to the doorway and stood with his hat in his hands while she was teaching the older children about the geography of the United States, tracing the routes of the major rivers on her hand-drawn map. She asked him, without looking up, whether he would like to add anything about the geography of this particular part of Kansas, and there was a startled silence before he said, in a careful voice, that the Arkansas River tended to run low by midsummer, and that the homesteaders to the east had learned that the hard way 3 years running. The children turned to look at him. He seemed slightly alarmed by this collective attention, as though he had not entirely planned on being a participant. But he came inside, ducking under the low doorframe, and spent the next 15 minutes telling them, in a few well-chosen words, what the land remembered and what it required of the people who lived on it. Lucy sat quietly and let him talk, watching the children's faces go from polite attention to genuine fascination, and she thought that, whatever Frederick Donovan was, he was not a man without depth. When the children filed out at the end of the afternoon, he stayed behind for a moment, looking at the map on the makeshift wall. "You drew this yourself," he said. "I did. It is accurate. I am glad to hear it." He looked at her with that same quality of direct attention that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he engaged with things he found worth engaging with. "You are good at this," he said. Coming from Frederick Donovan, who chose his words with the economy of a man who did not have unlimited resources to spend on them, this was significant. Lucy felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. "Thank you," she said simply, and that was enough. May settled into June and the cattle work intensified. The spring roundup was in full motion, and the Double W was alive from before dawn to well after dusk, with the organized, controlled chaos of a large ranch in its busiest season. Lucy adjusted her teaching schedule to account for the fact that several of the older children were now needed at home for morning chores, moving her sessions to the afternoons, and she began spending her mornings helping Bess in the kitchen or helping Clara Whitmore with correspondence, making herself useful in the ways available to her. She also began riding again. Not on the borrowed mule, which had been returned to its owner in Caldwell, but on a steady quarter horse named Pepper that Samuel Whitmore made available to her, saying she ought to know the land if she was going to be teaching its children. She started with short rides around the immediate pastures, reacquainting herself with the rhythm of it, and gradually extended her range as her confidence grew. It was on one of these rides that she got turned around. It happened simply enough. She had ridden out toward the eastern boundary in the late afternoon, following a dry creek bed that she had been told made a good landmark, and the sky had clouded over quickly, and without her noticing, until the light was gone from the land, and the familiar shapes of the terrain had all flattened into something uniform and gray. The creek bed forked, and she took the wrong branch and rode for 20 minutes before realizing she had no idea where she was. She was not panicked. She was, however, acutely aware that in 1882 on the Kansas prairie, being lost in the approaching dark was a serious problem regardless of how calm you felt about it. She pulled Pepper to a stop and sat still, listening. The wind had picked up. Somewhere to the west, which was the direction she thought the ranch was in, she could hear cattle. She turned Pepper that way and started riding. She had covered perhaps half a mile when she heard hoofbeats coming fast through the tall grass to her right, and then Frederick Donovan materialized out of the dusk on his black horse like something the landscape had simply produced on its own terms. He pulled up alongside her, and for one fraction of a second, before his expression settled back into its usual controlled set, she saw something on his face that she did not immediately know how to name. It was there and gone so quickly that she might have imagined it, except that she was a careful observer of people and she did not think she had. "I rode east this afternoon," she said before he could speak. "The light changed faster than I expected. The creek bed forks," he said. "I should have told you. You were not to know I would follow it that far." They looked at each other in the gathering dusk, the horses standing patient beneath them. He had come looking for her. He had noticed she was not back and he had come looking for her, and the realization of this settled over Lucy with an unexpected warmth. "The ranch is this way," he said, turning his horse west. She fell in beside him, and they rode back in the companionable quiet that she was beginning to understand was its own form of communication with him. When the lights of the Double W came into view, she felt him let out a breath beside her that he had apparently been holding for some time. "Mr. Donovan," she said as they approached the barn. "Frederick," he said, which surprised her enough that she nearly drew rein. "Frederick," she repeated, and she was glad the darkness hid whatever was happening to her expression. "Thank you. You would have found your way," he said, and then after a pause, "but I am glad you did not have to." They were in Caldwell together for the first time in late June, both of them having business in town on the same day. Samuel had sent Frederick to settle an account at the feed store and to speak with the land agent about a property dispute on the eastern fence line, and Lucy had gone with Pete in the wagon to collect the new primers that Hattie had managed to source from the school supply company in Wichita. Lucy had finished her errand before Frederick was done with his, and she was sitting on the bench outside Hattie's store, enjoying a cold glass of water when a commotion erupted at the far end of the main street. A trail drive had come through the previous day, and the hands who had stayed the night were making a loud and enthusiastic exit, which involved a certain amount of shouting and the firing of guns into the air, which was technically illegal within the town limits and universally ignored as a practical matter. One of the horses, startled by the noise, broke loose and came charging down the street directly toward where Lucy was sitting. She had exactly enough time to stand up and step back against the wall of the store before the horse thundered past, close enough that she felt the displaced air of its passing on her face. In the next moment Frederick was there. He had come from the direction of the land agent's office, moving fast, and he stepped between her and the continuing commotion with such complete and instinctive decisiveness that she was momentarily silenced. His hand was on her arm, just above the elbow, steadying her against the wall, and he was looking at the street with the sharp attention of a man assessing whether more was coming. When it became clear that the runaway horse was the only immediate concern, he turned to look at her, and their faces were closer than they had ever been. She could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the way his jaw was set with a tension that was all concern and no anger. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said, "not at all. It missed me entirely." He did not step back immediately. His hand was still on her arm and his eyes were still on her face, and the street noise seemed to recede slightly as though the world had agreed to give them just this moment. "You keep appearing exactly when I need steadying," she said softly, and she had not planned to say it quite that openly, but she did not regret it. Something in his face changed. Not the controlled shift she had seen before, but something deeper and less managed, something that looked like a man recognizing a truth he had been trying not to look at directly. He stepped back then, and the ordinary noise of Caldwell rushed back in, and he released her arm with a care that somehow made the gesture more notable, not less. "I should check on the runaway," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He walked away down the street, and Lucy sat back down on the bench and pressed her hands together in her lap and told herself to be sensible, which was extremely difficult given the state her heart was currently in. Hattie Drummond appeared in the doorway of the store with the expression of someone who had seen everything from her window and intended to pretend she had seen nothing at all. "More cold water," she offered. "Please," said Lucy. The weeks that followed were a kind of sweet and complicated torment that Lucy suspected Frederick was experiencing in his own way as well, though he remained characteristically difficult to read. He began finding reasons to be near the school in the afternoons that could not entirely be explained by ranch business. He started leaving things for her that she needed before she had mentioned needing them. A new length of rope to replace the one she had been using to hang her students' drawings. A bucket with a good handle to replace the broken one by the water pump near the schoolroom. A copy of a natural science book for children that he had apparently ordered through Hattie's store and left on the schoolroom table without a note, though Hattie told her later it had been Frederick who picked it up. He still did not speak easily or often, but when he did speak to her, the words were different from the ones he gave to everyone else. More considered, more personal, as though he was more careful with her, in the way you are more careful with things that matter. They fell into a habit of sitting together on the main house porch in the evenings after supper, when the heat had softened to something bearable, and the sky turned extraordinary colors over the flat western horizon. Clara Whitmore and Samuel sometimes joined them. More often they were alone, and the silence between them was full and comfortable, punctuated by conversation that gradually grew longer and more revealing. She learned that he had been born in Missouri, that he had come west at 18 after a flood took his family's farm and scattered them in 3 different directions, that he had worked cattle from Texas to Montana before landing at the W 4 years ago, and feeling, for the first time, that a place had some claim on him. He had a brother somewhere in Colorado whose letters arrived irregularly and who Frederick clearly cared about more than he admitted. He learned, in turn, that she had trained as a teacher in Cincinnati because she had believed, for a long time, that education was the most useful gift one person could give another, a belief her father had drilled into her with the particular passion of a man who had learned to read as an adult and understood precisely what it changed. That her mother's new husband was a respectable man who nevertheless made Lucy feel like a piece of furniture in a room that had been redecorated around her. That she had answered the advertisement for Caldwell on a Tuesday morning and mailed the letter before she could talk herself out of it. "You were not afraid," he said one evening, looking at the darkening sky. "I was terrified," she said honestly, "but I have found that terror and courage often feel quite similar when you are in the middle of them." He considered this for a long time. "That is true," he said. She looked at his profile against the last orange light of the sunset and thought that whatever wall he had built around himself, it was not built from cruelty or indifference, but from a long habit of not expecting the world to offer him softness, and the recognition of this made something in her chest ache in a way that was very different from pity. It was Samuel Whitmore who first said anything, and he said it to Lucy in the straightforward manner of a man who had spent 30 years ranching and had learned that indirect approaches wasted time. He stopped her one morning as she was crossing the yard and said, without preamble, "Frederick is a good man, Miss Brooks. I suspect you have already worked that out. But he does not know how to ask for what he needs. He may need some help understanding that it is permitted." Lucy looked at Samuel Whitmore for a moment. "Are you giving me advice about your foreman's personal life, Mr. Whitmore?" Samuel Whitmore's weathered face creased into something that might generously be called a smile. I'm observing that two people who have been finding excuses to occupy the same porch for the better part of 2 months might benefit from someone pointing out the obvious," he said. And then he went back into the barn with the air of a man who had said everything he intended to say on the subject. Lucy stood in the yard with the morning sun on her face, and the sound of the horses in the pasture, and the far-off voices of the ranch hands going about their work, and she made a decision. That evening on the porch, she brought 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen and handed him one and sat down beside him, a little closer than usual. The sky was putting on a remarkable performance, purples and deep golds over the flat horizon, and the air smelled of the cottonwoods along the creek and the clean, dry grass of the prairie. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When you rode out looking for me that evening in June, when I had gotten turned around," she kept her eyes on the sky. "Had you been worried?" A long pause, long enough that she began to wonder if she had miscalculated. "Yes," he said very quietly. She turned to look at him then, and he was already looking at her, and there was nothing controlled or managed in his expression in that moment. There was just the man himself, without any of the distance he habitually kept between himself and the world, and what she saw there was so honest and so unexpectedly vulnerable that she felt her own breath catch. "Frederick," she said. "I know," he said, which was not an answer to anything she had said but answered everything she had meant. He set his coffee cup down on the porch rail with great care. Then he turned toward her fully and lifted one hand and touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, so gently that it was barely a touch at all, and yet she felt it everywhere. "I did not come here expecting this," he said. "I have never been much good at," he stopped, searching for the word with the careful discipline of a man who did not use them carelessly. "At being known by someone," he finished. "You are better at it than you think," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, very softly and very slowly, the way a man does when he is not entirely sure he is allowed to and intends to make the most of it regardless. She kissed him back, which answered that question permanently. When they separated, he kept his hand against her cheek and she covered it with her own, and they sat like that in the fading light while the sky went dark and the first stars appeared over the double W, and Lucy thought that this was what it felt like when the thing you had been hoping for without naming it arrived at last. The summer of 1882 deepened around them like a long, golden afternoon that neither of them wanted to end. They were not reckless or careless about it. Frederick was constitutionally incapable of recklessness, and Lucy was too aware of the delicate social architecture of a working ranch, where everyone knew everyone else's business and propriety mattered practically as well as morally, to behave in any way that would have made her position awkward or her reputation questionable. But they were unmistakably, visibly in something. The ranch hands noticed. Bess noticed within approximately 4 minutes of the first morning after. Hattie Drummond noticed when they came into town together, and Frederick held the door of the store with a specific quality of attention that she later described to her husband as a man who has finally realized what his hands are for. They walked together in the evenings along the creek that ran through the southern edge of the property, where the cottonwoods made a green tunnel of shade, and the water moved quietly over smooth stones. He talked more when they were alone, not a flood of words. He would never be a man of floods, but a steady stream of things he was thinking and observing and remembering. And she understood that this was what Frederick Donovan giving someone access to himself looked like, and it was more valuable for being rare. He told her about the injustice of the cattle business, the way the large operators like the big rail-connected companies were systematically squeezing out smaller ranchers, the way land that had once been open range was being enclosed by people with legal power and capital who had never spent a night in a bedroll on the prairie, the way men worked themselves into the ground for wages that barely covered their keep, while others prospered enormously off their labor. He talked about it without self-pity, but with a clear-eyed anger that she respected, the anger of someone who understood the system well enough to name what was wrong with it. She told him about the broader world she had come from, the schools in Cincinnati, the newspapers and their debates about education and women's roles, the particular loneliness of being a woman with opinions in a society that was still very much deciding what to do with such creatures. She told him about her father, how he had read to her every night until she was old enough to read back to him, how his death had left a quiet in the house that her mother's remarriage had filled with the wrong sound. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave to weather reports and cattle counts, as though the information mattered and deserved to be treated accordingly. This was, Lucy reflected, perhaps the most intimate thing about him. In August, something happened that changed the texture of everything. A man arrived at the Double W looking for work. His name was Calhoun, and he was one of those men the territory seemed to produce occasionally who wore the shape of a cowhand but had something behind his eyes that was not quite right, something watchful and calculating that had nothing to do with cattle. Samuel Whitmore, who was a good judge of men but was also short-handed going into the late summer work, took him on provisionally. Frederick did not like him. He said so to Lucy that same evening on their walk, in a few direct and undramatic words, and she filed the information away. Within 10 days it became clear that Frederick's instinct was correct. Calhoun had been asking questions around the ranch about the cattle counts and the sales schedule, the kind of questions a new hand might ask innocently enough, but that accumulated into a pattern when you laid them out beside each other. He had also been in Caldwell twice in the evenings when he had claimed to be at the bunkhouse, and on the second occasion, he had been seen talking to a man from one of the competing cattle operations to the north, a man whose organization had been suspected in several incidents of cattle theft over the previous season. Frederick took this information to Samuel quietly and completely, and Samuel, who trusted his foreman's judgment absolutely on such matters, quietly let Calhoun go the following morning with his pay and a firm instruction to be off the property before noon. There was no confrontation, no drama, just the clean, efficient removal of a problem before it became a larger one. Calhoun, however, did not leave gracefully. As he rode out of the yard, he said something to Frederick, standing near the corral gate, that Lucy heard from the porch of the main house, though she could not make out the words. She saw Frederick's jaw tighten and his hands become very still at his sides, the particular stillness of a man exercising a great deal of control, and then Calhoun rode off down the road, and Frederick came up to the porch without any change in his expression. "What did he say?" she asked. Frederick looked at her for a moment. "Nothing worth repeating," he said. She knew from his face that it had been about her. She did not press. But that evening on their walk, when they reached the cottonwoods and the quiet of the creek, he stopped and turned to her and said, "I want you to know that I will not let anyone say things like that about you. Not here. Not anywhere." "I know," she said, and she meant it completely. He looked at her in the dappled shade of the cottonwoods with the creek sound around them and the late summer heat on the air, and he said, "Lucy." And the way he said her name was different from any way anyone had ever said it, as though it contained everything he found it difficult to say out loud. "Yes," she said, even though he had not asked a question yet. He smiled at that. A full, real smile that she had learned by now was one of his rarest and most valuable possessions, and he held out his hand, and she took it. September brought the beginnings of the cattle sale season, and a general quickening of activity across the Double W that made Frederick even harder to pin down than usual, his days stretching from first light to after dark with the concentrated labor of a working cattle operation at its most intense. Lucy saw him at meals and in the evenings, and she learned to read the particular quality of his tiredness, when it was the good tiredness of hard, satisfying work, and when it was the worn-down tiredness of a man carrying too much. On those evenings, she was simply present and did not demand conversation, and he seemed to understand what she was offering, which was company without expectation, and he accepted it in the way a man accepts water in the desert, with a recognition of its value that went beyond what he could easily put into words. She had written to her mother in late August, a careful and measured letter that conveyed that she was well and settled, and that there was a man she wanted to mention, and that she hoped her mother would be pleased, though she was not certain of it. Her mother's response, which arrived in mid-September, was characteristically complicated, full of concern expressed as caution and affection expressed as interrogation, but it ended with the admission that if Lucy was happy, then her mother supposed she must be glad, which from her mother was essentially a declaration of joy. She showed the letter to Frederick one evening, and he read it with his careful attention and handed it back and said, "She loves you, just that." And Lucy thought he was right. The sale season brought Whitmore and his foreman into Caldwell with greater frequency, and on one of those trips to town in early October, they stopped for supper at the hotel dining room, which was the best restaurant Caldwell offered, and it was during this supper, over roasted chicken and cornbread in the lamplight of the hotel's small, neat dining room, that Frederick Donovan said something that made Lucy's world rearrange itself. He had been quiet through most of the meal, in the way that usually meant he was building towards something. She had learned to wait it out rather than fill the silence with small talk, because filling his silences was like putting furniture in doorways. "I have been thinking," he said, setting down his fork, "about the future." "What aspect of it?" she asked carefully. He looked at her across the table with the full, clear directness that was his most characteristic way of engaging with things that mattered. "I have been at the W for 4 years," he said. "Samuel has offered me a share of the operation, a small one but real, enough to build on, enough to—" he paused, "enough to consider asking someone to share a life with." The dining room was quiet around them, just the sound of distant conversations and the clink of silverware from the kitchen. Lucy's heart was making it somewhat difficult to concentrate. "Is there someone specific you have in mind?" she asked, and she managed to keep her voice very level. He looked at her for another moment, and then one corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when he was trying not to smile and was losing the battle. "There is a woman," he said, "who came to teach school on this ranch in the spring and who has managed, in the space of 6 months, to be the most important thing in it." He stopped. "In my life," he corrected himself quietly. "The most important thing in my life." Lucy set her own fork down. Her hands were very steady, which surprised her. "Frederick," she said. "I'm not asking you to settle," he said, and something almost urgent came into his voice, as though this part needed to be said clearly. "I know what I am and what I have to offer, and that it is not much compared to—" "Stop," she said, gently but firmly. He stopped. "What you have to offer," she said, "is more than you understand, and I am not settling. I have never in my life settled for anything, and I do not intend to start now." He looked at her. The lamplight was warm and golden, and the hotel dining room might as well have been the only room in the world. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. They sat in the lamplight and looked at each other for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and the warm, solid weight of his hands around hers felt like something she had been waiting her whole life to find. They told Samuel and Clara Whitmore the next morning. Samuel shook Frederick's hand and clapped him on the shoulder with restrained but genuine emotion, and Clara Whitmore hugged Lucy with the warmth of a woman who had been hoping for this particular outcome for several months and was very glad it had finally arrived. Bess produced a celebratory cake at supper that she claimed she had been keeping back for a special occasion, which no one believed for a moment, and the ranch hands were informed and responded with the collective enthusiasm of a community that had been watching this particular development unfold for the better part of a year and felt personally invested in the outcome. Hattie Drummond, when she heard, said simply, "Of course," with the satisfaction of a woman whose read of a situation has been confirmed. They were married in November in the Caldwell Church, a small white building at the west end of the main street that served several different denominations on a rotating basis, and occasionally served as a town meeting hall in between. The minister was a pleasant man from Wichita who passed through monthly and was delighted to perform the ceremony. Lucy wore a dress that Clara Whitmore had helped her make, ivory-colored cotton with small blue flowers at the collar, and her dark hair was pinned up with the pearl combs that had been her grandmother's. She carried a small bunch of late-season prairie flowers that Elsa, one of her students, had gathered that morning with enormous seriousness, and presented at the church door with the air of someone who understood the importance of the occasion. Frederick wore his best coat, which was dark blue and had clearly been brushed within an inch of its life, and he stood at the front of the church and looked at Lucy coming down the short aisle with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who had learned, through long experience, not to expect the best from what the world offered, and who was confronted in this moment with evidence that the world was capable of exceeding all of his carefully managed expectations. She reached him and they stood facing each other, and the minister said the words that married people have been saying to each other for centuries. And when Frederick said, "I do," he said it with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything he believed absolutely. And when Lucy said, "I do," she said it with the clear voice of a woman who knew her own mind. He kissed her in front of the whole church with a restrained tenderness that nevertheless made Hattie Drummond dab at her eyes, and made two of the younger ranch hands elbow each other with suppressed grins. And then they were married, and the November light coming through the church windows was the color of warm honey, and everything was different and everything was exactly right. They moved into a small house that Samuel had helped Frederick begin building on the eastern edge of the Double W property over the summer. It was not large, 2 rooms to begin with, a main room that served as kitchen and sitting room and a bedroom, but it was solid and well built, and it sat on a gentle rise that looked east over the open grassland toward the horizon, which was Lucy's favorite view on the ranch. Frederick had put a wide window in the east wall of the main room specifically, so she could see that horizon in the morning light, and she had not said anything about this when she first noticed it, but she had looked at him for a long moment, and he had looked back with the knowledge of someone who has been paying close attention. Winter on the Kansas prairie was a serious matter. The first real blizzard of the season came in January and kept them both inside for 3 days, which was not a hardship in any way that Lucy regretted. They cooked together, which turned out to be something Frederick had a real aptitude for, and read aloud to each other in the evenings by the stove, and talked with the unhurried freedom of people who have nowhere else to be. She was reading her way through the natural science book he had bought her students, and had discovered she was genuinely fascinated by it. He had borrowed a book on the history of the cattle trade from Samuel's small library, and was making his way through it with the focused engagement of a man who likes to understand the systems he operates within. "You would have been a good student," she told him one evening. "You would have been a good teacher," he said, and then caught himself and added, "You are a good teacher, I know that. You were not sure when I arrived." "No," he agreed without embarrassment. "I was not fair to you then." "You came around," she said. "You made it rather difficult not to," he said, and there was warmth in his voice that still, even months later, made something in her chest feel like sunlight. Spring came back to the Double W with its usual force, the buffalo grass green and the wildflowers thick in the low places, and the cattle restless after the winter. The school reopened, and Lucy returned to her students with a small but noticeable number of changes to her routine, including the fact that she now walked to and from the schoolroom each day rather than riding, because by March it had become clear that she was expecting a child, and riding felt less comfortable than it had. Frederick's response to this news had been one of the few times she had seen him completely at a loss for his characteristic composure. He had stood in the kitchen of their small house in the early morning light and stared at her and then sat down quite suddenly in the nearest chair, as though the news had affected his structural integrity. She had waited, watching him with quiet affection while he reorganized himself around this new information. "Are you well?" he managed finally. "Very well," she said. "Entirely well. Please breathe, Frederick," he breathed. Then he stood up and came to where she was standing and took both her hands in his, and held them with a firmness that conveyed everything he was currently unable to put into words, which was considerable. She could feel the slight tremor in his hands, and she thought that this was the exact measure of how deeply he felt things, that the things he felt the most were the ones that most completely overrode his careful composure. "I am going to be," he started. "A very good father," she said. "Yes, I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are certain of a great deal," he said. "I am," she agreed. The pregnancy progressed well through the spring and into the summer. Lucy continued teaching until June, when the school session ended for the warm months and would not resume until September. She spent her days in the company of Clara Whitmore, who had raised 4 children on the same land, and whose knowledge of what was needed was extensive and practically offered, and with Bess, who claimed to have strong opinions about what a woman in Lucy's condition ought to be eating, and backed these opinions with remarkable culinary effort. Frederick managed his anxiety about her well-being by being quietly, consistently present without being smothering, which she appreciated enormously. He came home in the midday when he could, checking in without making a production of it. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He had, at some point, acquired a comfortable rocking chair from somewhere and placed it on the porch of their house without comment, and Lucy had not asked where it came from because she suspected the answer would be touching enough to be embarrassing for both of them. The baby arrived in late October, at the turn toward the 2nd year of their marriage, in the small but solid house on the east-facing rise. Clara Whitmore was present, and the doctor from Caldwell, who had ridden out quickly enough when Frederick had gone for him in the small hours of the morning, at a pace that the doctor later said he hoped never to be called upon to match again. It was a boy. He was born at dawn, which Lucy would always find appropriate, given how much Frederick loved the working start of a day, and he was healthy and loud about his arrival in the world, which the doctor said was an excellent sign, and which Frederick, sitting beside the bed with his new son in his arms for the first time, seemed to find simultaneously overwhelming and the most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed. They named him James, after Lucy's father. Frederick held the name in his mouth for a moment when she suggested it, testing the sound of it, and then nodded once with the certainty of a man recognizing a right answer. "James Donovan," he said quietly. And then he looked at his son, this small, fierce, new person who had arrived to rearrange everything, and the expression on his face was something Lucy knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had seen Frederick Donovan be capable and honest and strong and occasionally vulnerable and sometimes funny and always decent. But she had not yet seen this, the particular undone quality of a hard man confronted with something completely pure that is also entirely his responsibility. And the love in his face was so total and so unguarded that she pressed her lips together and blinked hard and thought, fiercely and gratefully, that she was the luckiest woman in the state of Kansas. James grew with the 2nd year of their marriage, changing shape and ability and opinion with bewildering speed, the way babies do when they are enthusiastic about the project of becoming a person. He was a sturdy, observant child who studied the world around him with dark eyes that were clearly his father's and a sociable curiosity that was clearly his mother's. And by the time he was pulling himself upright against the furniture in their small house and regarding the world from his new height with the satisfaction of someone who has just solved a significant problem, he had entirely reorganized the lives of everyone at the W around his existence. Frederick was a different kind of man as a father from what he had been before, which was not a contradiction but an expansion. He was still Frederick, quiet and certain, and possessed of more knowledge about the land and the cattle than he could easily articulate, but he had found a new register available to him in the presence of his son, lower and gentler, and full of a patience that was not the controlled patience of a man managing himself, but the natural patience of a man who finds the thing in front of him genuinely interesting. He brought James out to the corrals in the early evenings and held him up to see the horses, and narrated the world to him in a quiet, serious voice, as though laying out facts a person needed. And Lucy, watching from the fence rail, thought that this was perhaps the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The school had grown by its second year. 3 new families had settled within riding distance of the Double W, bringing additional children, and the old tack room had become genuinely insufficient. Samuel Whitmore, who had watched the school grow with a pride that had replaced his early skepticism entirely, funded the construction of a proper one-room schoolhouse on the edge of the ranch property in the late summer of their second year. A real building with real windows and a proper chalkboard, and enough desks for 16 students. Lucy had stood in the doorway of the finished building on the morning it was completed and felt something that she could only call joy, the clean, uncomplicated joy of a thing built well and built for the right reasons. Frederick stood beside her. "You built this," he said, and he meant the school, but also more than the school. "We built this," she said, and she meant the school, but also everything else. The third year brought another winter, another spring, and in the summer a letter from Frederick's brother in Colorado, saying that he was coming through Kansas on his way to a new position and would stop if he was welcome. Frederick wrote back immediately and with more visible pleasure than letters usually inspired in him, and his brother arrived in August, a man named Thomas who was 3 years younger and who had Frederick's dark eyes and considerably less of Frederick's economy of expression, talking from the moment his horse entered the yard in the cheerful, unstoppable manner of a man who had spent 3 years largely alone in the mountains and had a great deal saved up. Lucy liked him immediately. He was good with James, who was walking by now and had developed strong views about where he wanted to go at any given moment, which were often places he had been specifically told not to go. Thomas would follow his nephew around the yard with the amused patience of a man who found children genuinely entertaining, which Lucy appreciated enormously. He stayed for 2 weeks, and when he left, Frederick stood at the gate and watched him ride down the road with an expression that Lucy knew meant he was feeling something he would not say. And she came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together watching Thomas's shape get smaller against the long horizon. "He will come back," she said. "Yes," said Frederick, "I think he will." And he did, as it turned out, the following spring, this time not passing through, but arriving with a job offer from a small ranch to the north of Caldwell that needed an experienced hand. He settled in the area with the apparent intention of staying, and Frederick's evident satisfaction at having his brother nearby was quiet and deep, and showed itself in the particular ease of his bearing on the evenings when Thomas came to supper, and the 3 of them sat around the table in the small house with James asleep in the next room, and the prairie wind low and warm outside. The 4th year brought an addition to the house. Frederick built it himself, with help from 2 of the ranch hands and the advice of Samuel Whitmore, who had built most of his own structures over the years. It was a proper addition, 2 more rooms, so that the house had room to grow with them. He worked on it in the evenings and on weekend mornings, and Lucy brought him coffee and watched the walls go up with the particular pleasure of watching someone you love do something they are excellent at. "You should have been a builder," she told him one evening. "I am a builder," he said, not pausing in his work, "among other things." In the autumn of the 4th year she told him there would be another child. He received this news with considerably more composure than he had managed the first time, though there was still a moment where he sat down, which she had come to understand was simply what his body did when his emotions got ahead of his usual management of them, and she waited for him to reorganize himself, which he did more quickly this time. "James will be glad," he said. "James will be outraged," she said. "He is extremely accustomed to being the only one." Frederick considered this with genuine seriousness. "We will explain it to him carefully," he said. "It will not matter how carefully we explain it," she said. "He will still be outraged, but he will come around. He always does." Which was true. James had his father's adaptability, once he had decided to deploy it, and his mother's sociable nature that eventually made company more appealing than protest. The second child arrived in the spring of the 5th year. Another boy, smaller than James had been but no less emphatic about his arrival, with Lucy's blue eyes and a head full of dark hair that made Frederick look at him, and then look at Lucy, and then look at him again, with the expression of a man encountering an unexpected piece of himself in something new. They named him Robert, after no one in particular but because it fit him, a name with some weight to it, and James, after the initial period of outrage that Lucy had correctly predicted, came to regard his brother with a cautious and possessive interest that would, over the years, grow into the complicated, devoted friendship of brothers. The Double W continued to grow and change around them. Samuel Whitmore, at 70, was beginning to step back from the daily work of the operation, and it was increasingly Frederick who ran the ranch in all practical terms, which was what everyone had expected for years and what Samuel had been building toward. The share of the operation that Samuel had given Frederick had grown, through careful work and good years, into something substantial, and the Donovan name was known through Caldwell and beyond as a name associated with honest cattle work and good management. Lucy's school had grown into something she had not entirely anticipated when she arrived with her primers and her painted chalkboard. It was, by the 5th year, regarded as one of the better one-room schools in the county, drawing students from a wider area and operating 10 months of the year. She had been asked twice by the county school board to take on a supervisory role for other rural schools in the area, an offer she had considered seriously both times and both times declined, because what she wanted was to be here, in this school, with these children, doing this specific thing. She talked about this with Frederick one evening in the rocking chair on the porch of their expanded house, James and Robert both asleep inside, the stars very bright over the Kansas plain. She was trying to explain why the supervisory role, which would have been a recognition of her abilities and a step up by any conventional measure, did not appeal to her, and he listened to all of it with his complete attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What you are doing here matters to specific people in a specific place. That is not a lesser thing than something larger. It may be more." She looked at him in the starlight. This was one of the things she loved most about Frederick Donovan, that he understood in his bones the value of work that was attached to a place and to particular people, the value of roots and the knowledge that comes from staying. "You have become much more eloquent," she said. "You taught me," he said, which made her laugh, and the sound of her laughter in the warm night was everything. There was a conversation she had with Clara Whitmore in the 6th year that stayed with her. Clara, who was aging with the same gracious practicality she brought to everything, had been talking about the changes she had seen in the territory over the decades, the way the land had been divided and enclosed, the way the people who had come to settle it had changed it and been changed by it in return, and the way the original people of the land, the Comanche and the Kiowa and others who had known this territory long before any of them had arrived, had been pushed from it with a violence and an injustice that Clara named plainly and without excuse. She said she was not sure the land itself had ever fully absorbed what had been done, that the prairie remembered things in its own way, and that the people who lived on it now had an obligation to know the history of what they stood on, not to be paralyzed by it, but to carry it with the honesty it deserved. Lucy brought this into her school. She taught her students the history of the land they lived on, who had lived on it before them, what had been taken and from whom, and what that meant for how they should understand their own presence here. Some of the parents objected. Lucy listened to their objections with respect and explained her reasons with clarity, and she did not change the curriculum. Frederick, when she told him about this, said simply that she was right and that he would say so to anyone who asked him, which no one tested him on because his opinion on such matters was well enough known in the community that the challenge was not considered worth making. She loved him enormously in that moment, as she had loved him in 100 other moments. But this one had a particular quality to it, the quality of being entirely seen and entirely supported by the one person whose opinion of her mattered most. The 7th year of their life together on the Double W brought a summer that was exceptional even by Kansas standards, hot and bright and long, with the prairie grass curring early and the cattle moving sluggishly in the heat. Frederick managed the ranch through it with the steady competence of a man who had seen hard summers before and knew what they required: conserving water, rotating the pastures, adjusting the work schedule to protect his men and his animals from the worst of the heat. Thomas Donovan had, by this point, become as much a part of the fabric of their life as the ranch itself. He came to supper twice a week at least, and spent Sundays with James and Robert in a capacity that was somewhere between uncle and honorary additional father, teaching James, who was now 6 and entirely convinced of his own readiness for any challenge, to ride properly, with the patient thoroughness of a man who took the task seriously. James received these lessons with the combination of fierce determination and occasional frustrated tears that characterized his approach to everything difficult. And Robert, who was 3 and conducting his own investigation into the physics of everything around him, observed from a safe distance with his blue eyes wide and assessing. It was Thomas, in a rare moment of direct personal comment, who said to Frederick one Sunday evening while Lucy was putting the boys to bed and the 2 brothers were sitting on the porch, "You are a different man than the one I was looking for when I came through Caldwell 4 years ago." Frederick looked at his brother. "Different how?" "Easier," Thomas said. "Not easier on others, easier on yourself." He paused. "She did that." Frederick was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark plain. "She did a great deal of things," he said, "most of them better than I could have managed." Thomas nodded. "I know, I came to say that." Lucy, who had finished putting the boys to bed and come quietly back to the doorway, heard these last words but did not go out. She stood for a moment in the warm interior dark of the house, with the sounds of her sleeping children behind her and the voices of these 2 men on her porch, and she felt, in that moment, a completeness so thorough and so textured with everything that had led to it, all the courage and the fear and the choice and the work and the love, that it was almost too large to be contained in a single moment. But it was. It was contained entirely in this house, on this rise in this life. She went back out to the porch and sat beside Frederick, and he reached over without looking and took her hand. And Thomas Donovan talked about his horses and the price of hay and the weather coming in from the west. And the stars were very bright over the Kansas plain, and everything that had needed resolving was resolved, and everything that had needed building was built. By the time James Donovan was 8 years old, he could help with the morning feed and knew the names of every horse on the Double W, and had strong opinions about cattle that he delivered to his father with a seriousness that Frederick received with equal seriousness, even when James was wrong, which Frederick would correct afterward with the patient specificity of a man who took the education of his children as seriously as he took anything. Robert, at 5, was a different creature entirely from his brother. He was quieter and more watchful and deeply interested in how things worked, not the cattle and the horses that James loved, but the mechanisms and structures of the world, the water pump and the hinge on the barn door, and the way the rain barrel filled and why. He would sit with Lucy during school sessions when she allowed it, and attend with a focus that made some of the older children look slightly embarrassed by comparison. Lucy looked at her 2 boys and thought of the woman who had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed mule in the spring of 1882 with nothing but a carpetbag and a determined heart, and the distance between that woman and the one she was now felt both enormous and entirely logical, a direct line drawn through every choice and every day. She was 31 years old. She had a school she had built into something real and lasting. She had a home she had helped make from the ground up, not only the physical house but the life in it. She had a husband who was, still and always, the most honest person she had ever known, and whose love for her showed itself in 10,000 quiet ways every day, because he was not a man who was ever going to do things loudly when he could do them well. She had 2 sons who were as different from each other as 2 people from the same parents could be, and who were, both of them, excellent. One evening in the late fall, when the harvest was done and the cattle work had eased into the slower rhythms of winter preparation, she and Frederick sat together on the porch in the cold, clear air with blankets over their knees and the stars very brilliant overhead, and she said, "Do you remember what you told me, the first time you said more than 2 words to me? At the south pasture fence." He thought about it. "I said the mare gets out every spring," he said. "And I said she was determined, and you said she was stubborn. But I said it with affection," he said. "You did," she agreed. "I noticed." He turned to look at her in the cold starlight. He was 38 years old, and the Kansas weather and the years of outdoor work had added to him rather than diminished him, the way years add to certain kinds of people who have always been fundamentally themselves. His dark hair had a thread of gray at the temple that had appeared sometime in the 5th year, and which she had pointed out to him, and which he had been indifferent to in the way he was indifferent to all information about his own appearance. "I noticed you before that," he said. "You were leading Duchess back to the gate, and you were talking to her as though she was a person who deserved an explanation." "She is a horse who deserves an explanation," Lucy said. "That was precisely what I thought," he said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and old, and hers in a way that she knew had been building since that first afternoon at the south pasture fence, growing quietly and steadily in the way things grow that have good roots. She leaned over and rested her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the cold prairie night with their house warm behind them, and their sons sleeping inside, and the double W spread out around them in the dark, and the thing between them. This love that had been built from a borrowed mule and an escaped gray mare and a painted chalkboard and an honest conversation at a fence rail, and 1,000 evenings on this porch and 2 boys with their father's eyes and their mother's curiosity, was complete and whole and permanent, settled into the Kansas earth as surely as the roots of the cottonwoods along the creek. There was nothing left unresolved. There was nothing missing. There was only this life, fully built, fully inhabited, fully theirs, stretching forward into a future that was not frightening but warm, lit by everything that had already been made true between them. Lucy Brooks had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed mule with a heart full of determination, and had found, against all reasonable expectation, and through every improbable mercy of a wild and generous land, exactly what she had not known she was looking for. And Frederick Donovan, who had come west at 18 with a flood behind him, and learned to hold the world at arm's length because the world had not given him reason to do otherwise, had found in her the one person who had made the distance unbearable and the closeness not only possible, but the thing he could no longer imagine living without. The prairie wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek in the dark, and the horses were quiet in the pasture, and somewhere a great distance away a coyote called once and went silent, and the stars over the double W were as bright and as permanent as anything in the world has ever been. They stayed on the porch a long time that night, neither of them in any hurry to move, because there was nowhere else either of them would rather have been.